Welcome to Rio de Janeiro, scene of the Brazilian Grand Prix, the first round of the 1988 FIA World Championship. And what a superb venue this is, one of the most spectacular and vibrant cities in the world. Gone are the memories of February's floods, and instead the sun shines strongly, most of the time, to bring an early taste of summer to the European teams travelling out to South America at Easter. But most of the action will take place out here, some 15 kilometres west of Rio, at the Yacarapagua circuit, now named after this man, Nelson Piquet, the defending world champion, now driving for Lotus. His major rival, as far as the locals are concerned, is compatriot Ayrton Senna, who has moved with Honda engines to McLaren, where he joins France's Alain Prost, a four-time winner of the Brazilian Grand Prix. Michele Alboreto and Ferrari cannot be discounted either. After all, Ferrari and this man, Gerhard Berger, won the final two races of 1987 in virtually identical equipment. Nigel Mansell leads the charge of the normally aspirated runners, his Williams now powered by a Judd engine. But Thierry Boutsen is also strongly favoured in the Benetton Ford team, where he is now joined by Italy's Alessandro Nannini, the joker in the pack in more ways than one. In this transitional year, the 1.5-litre turbo engines were restricted to 2.5 times atmospheric pressure, with a fuel capacity limit of 150 litres. The 3.5-litre normally aspirated engines, such as Judd and Ford, had unlimited fuel available, the sport's governing body intending to give the normally aspirated users the advantage in preparation for 1989, when only those engines could be used. Turbos would be banned. The season got off to a full start when poleman Ayrton Senna's gearbox linkage failed on the grid. He had to start from the pits, so Nigel Mansell found himself on, effectively, pole position in the normally aspirated Williams Judd. But in the blast down to the first corner, it was Alain Prost who out-accelerated the Williams and went straight into the lead in his McLaren Honda, with Mansell in second place, Berger third. As Mauricio Gugelmin pulled off, he was nearly collected by Ayrton Senna and his own teammate Ivan Capelli, starting from the pit lane. Berger was soon up into second place ahead of Mansell, Piquet in fourth place. But Alain Prost was pulling away in front from Gerhard Berger in second place, and leading the normally aspirated challenge was Nigel Mansell in third, ahead of Nelson Piquet, Michele Alboreto in the Ferrari, and then the two Benettons of Thierry Boutsen and Alessandro Nannini. But then the normally aspirated challenge fell apart. Ivan Capelli retired in his March Judd. So did Riccardo Patrese in the Williams Judd. Alessandro Nannini was a pit visitor in his Benetton. The high temperatures were taking a toll of the normally aspirated cars, but the man who was really flying was Ayrton Senna in the McLaren Honda, here taking fifth place off Thierry Boutsen's Benetton Ford. Ahead of him was reigning champion Nelson Piquet in the Lotus Honda. But Senna made it look so easy going past the normally aspirated Benetton. And then it was Brazilian versus Brazilian, as Senna came up to take fourth place off Nelson Piquet, much to the delight of some Brazilians. So Senna up to fourth. And then that became third when Nigel Mansell retired in the pits after his Williams Judd stalled and they couldn't get it restarted. Senna then went up to second when Gerhard Berger came into the pits for new tyres. It was tough on tyres at Yacarapagua. But then it all turned sour on Ayrton Senna, and he was black flagged for taking his spare car after the green flag lap at the start. Sadly, he got out of his car after the drive of the race. The only Brazilian left in the race was Nelson Piquet, who, after two tyre stops and an incredible manoeuvre, overtook Derek Warwick for fourth place and Thierry Boutsen for third. Warwick also slipped through into fourth place. But there was something inevitable about this man winning the first race of the season in Brazil. Alain Prost on the way to his first victory of 1988. In second place was Gerhard Berger. Third, Nelson Piquet. And not a single normally aspirated engine in the first 6, as you can see on the left. On the right, the points awarded to the first 6 in Brazil, the first Grand Prix of 1988. And then we moved on to Imola for the San Marino Grand Prix, the second round of the FIA's World Championship. Of course, all these Italians had come to see their beloved Ferraris. Michele Alboreto, however, would start at the back of the grid after a problem on the warming-up lap. Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost on the front row of the grid. But when the lights turned green, it was Senna who made by far the better start, Prost being held up with a clutch problem. So in the charge up to the Tosa first corner, it was Ayrton Senna leading from Nelson Piquet, and then Riccardo Patrese in third place, ahead of Alessandro Nannini in fourth. Senna was already beginning to pull away. Nelson Piquet had the normally aspirated cars right behind him, and Gerhard Berger's Ferrari in there just ahead of Alain Prost and Eddie Cheever. As Senna pulled away, Prost and Berger started to move up. Berger overtook Alessandro Nannini's Benetton for fourth place. Going into Tosa, and on the way out, it was Alain Prost who drew alongside and pulled ahead into fifth. A few laps later, Prost was to do the same thing, pulling alongside Gerhard Berger going up the hill and moving into fourth place. Ahead of him, he had Riccardo Patrese, and soon disposed of him. He was up into third and now right behind Nelson Piquet's Lotus Honda. Soon, Prost was right in Piquet's slipstream. It was Honda versus Honda, McLaren versus Lotus. And the McLaren slipstreamed alongside and into second place, going into Tosa. Then Piquet had the two Benettons and Nigel Mansell's Williams to contend with. Mansell overtook Boutsen and even overtook the Lotus Honda of Nelson Piquet, his former teammate. But on the long drag up to Tosa, Honda power got the better of the normally aspirated Williams Judd, and Piquet was back up to third again. Mansell trying hard to defend his place from the Benetton Ford behind him, but soon he was out of the race with engine trouble. So too was Michele Alboreto in the beloved Ferrari. But out in front, no one could do anything about this man, Ayrton Senna, who came up to take his first victory of the season. Alain Prost closed right up behind him in the closing stages, and together they pulled off at the end of a race that was gruelling on fuel. So a 1-2 for the McLaren-Honda duo. In third place, Nelson Piquet again. Fourth was the first of the normally aspirated runners, Thierry Boutsen in the Benetton Ford. Fifth, Gerhard Berger. And sixth, Alessandro Nannini in the second of the Benettons. The next stop in the championship was just along the Mediterranean coast, Monaco, playground of the rich and famous and home to so many of the Grand Prix drivers. On the front row of the grid were the two McLaren Hondas, driven by those drivers, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, who had won for the last 4 years on this circuit. And it was Ayrton Senna who got the jump, going straight into the lead, with Gerhard Berger getting ahead of Alain Prost to take second place. Third was Prost. And further back, Nelson Piquet was in the wars as he collided with Derek Warwick's Arrows. Senna, meanwhile, was pulling away as Gerhard Berger held on to second place, ahead of Alain Prost. Piquet overtaken by one of the Arrows. Senna pulling away. Berger, Prost. Then Nigel Mansell ahead of Michele Alboreto, Alessandro Nannini, Riccardo Patrese, Derek Warwick and Jonathan Palmer well up. Then came Eddie Cheever, Philippe Alliot and Nelson Piquet on his way to the pits and out of the race. Senna, meanwhile, was pulling away, leaving Gerhard Berger also pulling away from Alain Prost. Then came Nigel Mansell with Michele Alboreto right behind him, and then Alessandro Nannini. But the real battle of the race was between Gerhard Berger and Alain Prost. Time and time again, Prost would look for a way round the outside of Berger, but Berger would hang on to his second place. Teammate Alboreto, meanwhile, found this the only way to get past Nigel Mansell. He moved up to fourth place. Mansell's teammate, Riccardo Patrese, was stuck behind Philippe Alliot, and when Alliot tried to move out of the way, the two of them came together. Alliot crashing, but fortunately being unhurt. And then Alain Prost found his way past Gerhard Berger and up into second place. Prost soon pulling away from the Ferrari, but he needn't have worried. His own teammate Ayrton Senna, in a lapse of concentration, went off and into the barriers and out of the race. He had been in an unassailable lead. And while he kicked himself, Alain Prost continued on his way to the checkered flag. So it was Alain Prost winning for the fourth time in 5 years on this tortuous Monegasque circuit. Checkered flag for the second time in 1988. And in second place, Gerhard Berger in the Ferrari, ahead of his own teammate Michele Alboreto. Prost, Berger and Alboreto. Fourth was Derek Warwick, fifth in the first of the normally aspirated cars, Jonathan Palmer, and sixth, Riccardo Patrese. Alain Prost now had a 10-point lead in the championship. Now the series went transatlantic, and the first stop was in Mexico City. Round 4 of the championship would be held here, 6,000 feet up, at the Circuito Hermanos Rodriguez. But this man, Philippe Alliot, first of all, before the race, had a lucky escape. His Lola got out of shape out of the very fast final corner, spun across the road, hard into the pit wall, crumpled up, and then bounced back across the track, disintegrating as it went. Alliot, amazingly enough, was unhurt. And even more amazing, the car was repaired for the race the next day. The accident not only proved the strength of modern Formula One racing cars, but justified the exacting regulations to which they are built. The McLaren men were once again on the front row of the grid. But Alain Prost made the better start as Ayrton Senna's pop-off valve began to open. And while Prost took the lead, it was Nelson Piquet up into second, ahead of Ayrton Senna third. Here, the turbos were expected to be very much favoured because of the altitude. Indeed, they occupied the first 7 places on the first lap, with Nannini the first normally aspirated driver. Prost, Piquet, Senna, Nakajima, Berger, Alboreto, Chiva, and then Nannini ahead of Derek Warwick. Senna moved up ahead of Piquet at the end of lap 1, while Derek Warwick moved ahead of Alessandro Nannini. So it was 2 McLarens, then 2 Lotuses, 2 Ferraris, 2 Arrows, 2 Benettons, and then Bernd Schneider in the West Zakspeed. Philippe Alliot's brave run soon came to an end, while Gerhard Berger was trying to upset the status quo and trying to overtake Nelson Piquet, but Piquet slammed the door. Berger, however, hung on. Slipstreaming third place Piquet down the long main straight. He ducked out of the slipstream at the end and cleanly moved up into third place, behind the 2 McLaren Hondas. René Arnoux, meanwhile, was going round without a rear wing, having been in collision with Alex Caffey's Dallara. But the battle of the race was between the 2 Arrows Megatrons, Derek Warwick and Eddie Chiva, in 7th and 8th places. They were never much more than this apart, and frequently much more close together. Then Satoru Nakajima retired from 6th place in the Lotus Honda. Was this the beginning of a Honda failure? Meanwhile, the Arrows boys were still at it, with Derek Warwick resisting the advances of teammate Eddie Cheever. These two seasoned campaigners were fighting a difficult but fair battle. Still, the pair of them went at it hammer and tongs, Warwick and Cheever. And then the Lotus team's worst fears were realised as Nelson Piquet pulled off with engine failure out of 4th place. But no one could do anything about this man, Alain Prost, as he continued all the way round that long final corner towards his 3rd checkered flag, his 3rd victory of the season. In 2nd place was teammate Ayrton Senna. And 3rd, Gerhard Berger in the Ferrari. 4th was Michele Alboreto in the 2nd of the Ferraris. 5th and 6th, those two Arrows drivers, Derek Warwick and Eddie Cheever. Alain Prost was now 15 points ahead of his nearest challenger, Gerhard Berger, as the series moved north to Canada and the new Montreal circuit. After a year's absence, the Canadian Grand Prix was back to a warm welcome from the locals. Once again, the McLarens were on the front row of the grid, with Ayrton Senna on the left, and he found that the dirtier line when the lights turned green. For it was Alain Prost who made the better start. And it was he who got into the lead, as Eddie Cheever got very sideways further back. So Prost led, and the locals were delighted. Prost led from Senna, Gerhard Berger looking for a way round the 2nd of the McLarens. Alboreto was 4th. Then came the two Benettons, Piquet in the Lotus Honda and Nigel Mansell. Soon, the two McLarens and Berger began to pull away. From Alboreto in 4th, then Boutsen, Nannini, Piquet, Mansell and Cheever. And then it became the head-to-head battle between the two McLaren Hondas that everyone had waited all season to see. Boutsen overtook Alboreto for 4th place. And then Patrese tried to do the same thing to Eddie Cheever. Cheever spun out, Patrese continued. And then so did Eddie Cheever rejoin. Senna, meanwhile, was putting as much pressure as he could on his teammate Alain Prost. And then, coming into the hairpin, he slid wide, came down the inside of Prost and into the lead. Senna led from Alain Prost. Prost, however, was sure to fight back, and he remained right in the slipstream of his teammate. Could he fight back and take the lead back from his own teammate Ayrton Senna? This, however, was a long, hard race. Gerhard Berger went out with electrical problems when in 4th place. Nigel Mansell went out with a blown engine when in 5th. Michele Alboreto had a holed radiator. When he went out, he was in 4th place. And after a tremendous race to 5th place from Philip Streff, he hit a wall and damaged suspension. 4th and 5th did not seem to be good places to hold. And poor old Andrea de Cesaris went out when he was in 5th place, having run out of petrol on the very, very last lap. Ayrton Senna, meanwhile, had no such problems and continued to his 2nd checkered flag of the year. Victory then for Ayrton Senna. Behind him, and with fuel consumption problems, his own teammate Alain Prost. And for the first time this year, Thierry Boutsen. It would not be the last. 4th was Nelson Piquet, 5th Ivan Capelli and Jonathan Palmer in 6th place. But Alain Prost now had a 15-point lead over his own teammate Ayrton Senna as the championship moved south, a day's drive to Detroit. Like the Montreal circuit, this downtown street track also has a high rate of attrition. While Ayrton Senna started from the front row of the grid, he was joined by Gerhard Berger in the Ferrari this time. But it was Senna who made the best start, with Berger slotting into second place ahead of Alboreto and Prost. And on the first lap, Prost was further demoted by Thierry Boutsen, down to fifth place, just ahead of Alessandro Nannini. In car with Mauricio Gugelmin, you can see just why this circuit is so tight and so tough. Look at those barriers and walls on either side. Senna ahead of Berger, then a gap to Alboreto, then Thierry Boutsen ahead of Alain Prost, Nannini, and then the first of the Williams Judds. But Alain Prost soon got his fourth place back from Thierry Boutsen. And then moved up right on the tail of Michele Alboreto. And as he came out of the Atwater tunnel, Prost pulled up alongside and went into third place, a highly unusual manoeuvre. Prost was soon up into second place as Gerhard Berger pulled off with a puncture, and everyone else moved up a place as well, of course. And while Gerhard Berger parked his Ferrari, teammate Michele Alboreto was also in trouble as Alessandro Nannini came alongside and then hit the Ferrari, which spun out. Alboreto, however, was able to rejoin after a three-point turn. Ayrton Senna laps Mauricio Gugelmin. Senna completely unchallenged as he pulled away from teammate Alain Prost. Derek Warwick found out how hard those barriers are as he retired his arrows. Ayrton Senna even had time for a quick tyre change. All four tyres off the jacks and back into the race without losing the lead. Senna rejoined ahead of teammate Alain Prost. The Brazilians, of course, were delighted. Sambas all round. Julian Bailey crashed his Tyrrell on the very, very last lap, while Ayrton Senna was taking it extremely carefully on the treacherous track surface, overtaking Bailey's parked car. Senna even had time for a little wave on his last lap. So the third checkered flag for Ayrton Senna in this season. It was also his third win running on this circuit. The Brazilians, of course, were delighted. Alain Prost was second. Third, for the second week running, was Thierry Boutsen. Fourth, finally, Andrea De Cesaris. And fifth, Jonathan Palmer on this street circuit. Pierluigi Martini claimed Minardi's first ever point in the World Championship. After 3 races in the Americas, teams and drivers flew back to Europe and to the Mediterranean for round 7 in the championship, the French Grand Prix at Circuit Paul Ricard. For the first time in 1988, Ayrton Senna wasn't on pole position, but he was on the front row with teammate Alain Prost, who made a superb start to lead down into the first corner. In fact, Senna was demoted by Berger, but muscled through into second place at the first corner. So it was Alain Prost from Ayrton Senna, then Berger and Alboreto, and then Nelson Piquet. Behind him came the 2 Benettons of Boutsen and Nannini. Prost was soon beginning to pull away a little from Senna, who was still being challenged by Berger. Alboreto was in 4th, Piquet 5th, Boutsen 6th, Nannini 7th, Mansell 8th, Nakajima 9th, and Derek Warwick 10th. Berger had a spin and went from 3rd down to 6th. However, he was able to recover, but headed for the pits for new tyres. But his wasn't the only tyre stop, however. Soon, Riccardo Patrese was in the pits for a scheduled tyre stop. And in the background, Ayrton Senna was also in the pits for new tyres on his McLaren. He was in second place and unable to catch Alain Prost, had come in early. Soon Prost came in for new tyres as well. But this was a slightly longer stop for the leader. Watch the front left tyre. It takes a little bit longer, and Alain Prost rejoined in second place after teammate Ayrton Senna had got into the lead. Prost now began a chase in front of his own countryman, which was to bring him up on the tail of Ayrton Senna. And as they came up to lap back markers, Senna found himself boxed in behind one of the Minardis, and Prost went shooting through and up into the lead. So Prost led from Senna. Further back, Michele Alboreto was in third place. In the closing stages, Prost pulled away from teammate Senna, who suffered severe gearbox problems, and Prost was the popular winner. The checkered flag for the fourth time this year. Alain Prost, winner of the French Grand Prix. Ayrton Senna, however, survived for second place. Michele Alboreto in third, ahead of teammate Gerhard Berger. Fifth was Nelson Piquet, sixth Alessandro Nannini. Alain Prost now with a 15-point lead over his own teammate Ayrton Senna, the McLaren men leaving behind the Ferrari boys. But all that would change in the rain at Silverstone. The miserable weather continued almost all weekend, and it would be the first wet Grand Prix since 1985. Neither McLaren was on the front row at Silverstone. It was the two Ferraris of Berger and Alboreto who accelerated away in the rain, slithering, their tyres searching for grip. Alain Prost found none at all. As they went through the first corner, he was only ninth. But it was Berger leading from Alboreto, Senna in third, and then Mauricio Gugelmin in fourth. Huge balls of spray accelerated round the circuit, with Senna moving up into second place ahead of Alboreto. And this would be the battle during the early stages, as Berger led the Brazilian. Berger, Senna, Alboreto in third place. The appalling visibility in the spray soon spaced out the field. Philip Streff, however, had other problems. His rear wing broke, and when he parked his car, it stuck in the mud. Out on the track, however, Berger was boxed in behind Alain Prost, who had slipped way back, and Senna slipped through and into the lead, almost knocking off his own teammate Alain Prost as he did so. So Senna led from Berger, Alain Prost way back in the field. And then Mansell came up to overtake both Nannini and Alboreto for fourth place. Alboreto, however, managed to hang on to his third, but Nannini spun out and would rejoin sixth. Alboreto was then caught by Mansell. Mansell right up with the Italian, and then slipping through up into third place. Just as Prost excites the French, so Mansell delights the English. Then Prost came into the pits, his race run, his chassis handling appallingly in the wet conditions. Second-placed Berger was in problems with fuel consumption, and Mansell nearly drove off the track as he overtook him and moved up into second place. And as Senna headed for the checkered flag, Berger was even in more problems, leading Warwick, Cheever and Patrese. Berger in sixth place. As they came through the final corner and accelerated towards the checkered flag, the Ferrari faltered. In a flash, Warwick, Cheever and Patrese went through, 6th to 9th for Gerhard Berger. But Ayrton Senna had taken his fourth victory of the year. Nigel Mansell was a delighted second, opening his points account for the year. And third was Alessandro Nannini. on the rostrum for the first time in his Grand Prix career. Mauricio Gugelmin's fourth place was also his best result. Fifth, Nelson Piquet. Sixth, Derek Warwick. Alain Prost's championship lead cut to 6 points. Halfway through the season, Prost and Senna had won 4 races each. The series then moved to the wooded circuit of Hockenheim for the German Grand Prix. Sadly, however, the weather was just as it had been at Silverstone. The McLarens were once again on the front row of the grid. Ayrton Senna again on pole, ahead of Alain Prost. But it was Gerhard Berger who went into second place, behind Ayrton Senna at the start, and Alessandro Nannini was up into third, with Prost back in fourth. Balls of spray as they accelerated through the woods. Senna, then Gerhard Berger, Alessandro Nannini, Alain Prost and Michele Alboreto, but not everybody had started on wet tyres. Nelson Piquet was on slicks and paid the price. Senna, meanwhile, was out in front and pulling away from Gerhard Berger. Through the spray was Alessandro Nannini in third place, ahead of Alain Prost. Nelson Piquet ended his 150th Grand Prix in the pits and out of the race. Gerhard Berger, meanwhile, was dropping back, but Alain Prost had got ahead of Alessandro Nannini and was now in a threatening third place. Philippe Alliot moved out of the way for Ayrton Senna, and on slick tyres and on the wet, he slid into the barrier and out of the race as well. Meanwhile, Alain Prost caught Gerhard Berger, and on the long back straight, slipstreamed up alongside the Ferrari and through into second place. Prost second, Berger in third, Nannini still in fourth place. Nigel Mansell had been in seventh place, came into the pits and wanted to retire, but the team sent him out again. Alex Caffey's problems were a little bit more obvious and more tiresome. Gerhard Berger survived this incident with Piercarlo Insani, visibility in the wet extremely difficult, and Berger announcing his anger. Indeed, the Ostkurve was not an easy place for many of the drivers. Even Alain Prost had an uncharacteristic spin. Fortunately, he kept the engine running and was able to rejoin in second place. And poor Alessandro Nannini had his throttle linkage break right at the end when he was in fourth place, and he dropped out of the running. But in the wet conditions, no one can match Ayrton Senna. Unbeatable in the wet conditions, he headed for win number 5 of the 1988 Grand Prix season. In second place, behind him, teammate Alain Prost. And third was Gerhard Berger after that incident. Fourth, his teammate Michele Alboreto. Fifth, Ivan Capelli. Sixth, Thierry Boutsen. But Alain Prost's lead in the championship was down to just 3 points. From West Germany, the championship headed east to Budapest and the Hungarian Grand Prix, one of the toughest races on the calendar, surely one of the twistiest circuits. Joining Ayrton Senna on the front row of the grid was Nigel Mansell, even though he was suffering from chickenpox. Alain Prost was way back in 7th spot and losing places at the start, as Mansell challenged Senna going down into the first corner. But it was the Brazilian ahead of Mansell, then the 2 Benetton Fords. Senna trying hard to pull away, but Mansell tailing him. Riccardo Patrese up into third, ahead of the Benettons. Senna and Mansell, Patrese, Boutsen, Nannini, Berger, Capelli, Gugelmin, and then Prost. Prost way back in 9th place. And Mansell was certainly in determined mood. Here, the normally aspirated cars perhaps having their best chance for many a race. And already Prost moving ahead of Gugelmin up into 8th place. Senna and Mansell pulling away slightly from Patrese, Boutsen, Nannini. Prost now moving further ahead, but once again Philipp Streff was the man with the unique problem. This time a wheel fallen off. Fortunately it didn't hit anyone else. At the front, Mansell kept up that challenge, sticking right on the rear wing of Ayrton Senna, but sometimes too close. Deprived of downforce, the car ran wide, went round once. Mansell kept it going, and although he lost 2 places, he was still in the race. But Alain Prost was the man on the move, picking off the normally aspirated cars one after another. And when he overtook Thierry Boutsen's Benetton Ford, he was up into 2nd place. Then it was just a case of Ayrton Senna ahead of him, and when Senna got held up by traffic, Alain Prost moved right up on his teammate's rear wing. Senna versus Prost, once again a head-to-head between the McLaren drivers. But as they came on to Hungaroring short straight, Senna was slightly boxed in and Prost took the initiative, going down on the inside of Senna into the first corner. But Prost ran wide, Senna went back into the lead again. Prost hung on, tailing his teammate all the way. But there was nothing he could do. Senna did not make another mistake. Alain Prost could only sit and watch. As they came up to the checkered flag, it was Ayrton Senna's 6th victory of the year. Alain Prost right behind him. And for the 3rd time in the year, Thierry Boutsen was also on the rostrum in 3rd spot. But now Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna tied for the lead of the championship with 66 points. But Senna had 6 victories to Prost's 4. The Frenchman had the whole of August to decide that if he was to stay in contention for the championship, he would have to win this race, the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. Even though Ayrton Senna was on pole position yet again, it was Alain Prost who made the best start down into Spa's tight La Source hairpin. Alain Prost through ahead of Ayrton Senna and then the 2 Ferrari drivers, and further back, quite a traffic jam. So Alain Prost led, but Ayrton Senna was right up with him. Then came Berger and Alboreto. And on the long drag up the hill, Ayrton Senna pulled alongside and went into the lead. Senna ahead of Prost. At the end of lap 1, Berger was in 3rd place, Alboreto 4th, and Thierry Boutsen in 5th place before a gap to the rest. The Belgian obviously wanted to do well at his home circuit. So Senna, Prost, Berger, Alboreto, Boutsen, then a gap to Nakajima, Nannini, Patrese, who on this occasion was joined by Martin Brundle replacing the unwell Nigel Mansell in the Williams team. Berger tried to take 2nd place off Alain Prost, but the Frenchman firmly slammed the door. Senna and Prost, but where was Berger? Alboreto was now in 3rd place. 4th, Thierry Boutsen. The Austrian Ferrari driver was in the pits with an electrical problem. Riccardo Patrese, meanwhile, was having a hard time from Ivan Capelli, fighting over 9th place. Capelli got alongside. He hung on bravely and overtook the Williams driver. Then he overtook Eddie Cheever as well. Now he was up into 8th place. Michele Alboreto pulled out of 3rd place in the Ferrari when his car started to fail. A black day for the Ferraris, who had lost their team patron earlier in the month. Nelson Piquet challenged by Alessandro Nannini for 4th place. Alessandro Nannini was really putting pressure on the world champion. The two of them locked up their brakes, and Nannini slipped through ahead of Piquet. Capelli was right up with them. So Nannini 4th, Piquet 5th, Capelli in 6th place. But Ayrton Senna was untroubled on his way to the checkered flag for the 7th time in 1988. Another victory for the Brazilian and for McLaren Honda. Second place for Alain Prost, who, he felt, had lost the World Championship. Third, for the 4th time, was Thierry Boutsen, at home in Belgium, and 4th, his teammate Alessandro Nannini. 5th was Capelli, ahead of Piquet, and Senna now led the World Championship by 3 points. Round 12 of the series was the Italian Grand Prix, held in the grounds of Monza's historic palace, spiritual home of Italian motor racing. These were the cars they'd come to see, of course, the Ferraris, but it was the McLarens on the front row of the grid as usual, and Alain Prost accelerating fast ahead of teammate Ayrton Senna. But when Prost got into third gear, the engine misfired and Senna took the lead into the first chicane. Ahead of Prost, then the two Ferraris, then Eddie Cheever well up after an excellent practice. So Senna, Prost, Berger, Alboreto, Cheever, Boutsen, Piquet and Riccardo Patrese. Senna soon pulling ahead, with Prost having to deal with Gerhard Berger. Riccardo Patrese looking for a way round Nelson Piquet. But on Monza's long straights, the normally aspirated cars would have a tough time, the turbos pulling away, and in particular Ayrton Senna. Patrese again looking for a way past Nelson Piquet. But Ayrton Senna was pulling away, Alain Prost coping with the two Ferraris. Michele Alboreto in 4th place, and Nelson Piquet soon out after a spin. Alain Prost, however, was in trouble. The team were running his Honda engine too lean. It was misfiring and burning a piston, and soon he was caught by Gerhard Berger, who moved ahead and up into 2nd place to the delight of the local crowd. Prost was soon in the pits and out of the race. The team told Senna to richen up his mixture, and that meant he had to drop back and was soon being caught by the Ferraris. Coming up to lap Jean-Louis Schlesser, who was deputising for Mansell still unwell, Senna caught the front wheel of the Williams, spun out and got stranded on a curb. Senna was out of the race. The Ferraris led. Here it is in slow motion. Schlesser keeping well out of the way. On the left, Senna clips the curb and then clips the front wheel of the Williams and spins out. It was to the enormous delight of the locals, because it meant Gerhard Berger led, Michele Alboreto in 2nd place and closing on his teammate. Berger and Alboreto on the back straight, coming up to overtake Mauricio Gugelmin. This would break the stranglehold of the McLaren team on the 1988 season. For the first time, both McLarens were out. For the first time, they didn't win a race. For the first time, Ferrari did. Berger first, Michele Alboreto in 2nd place. A fantastic day for the Ferraris, a fantastic day for Italy, and in 3rd place, Eddie Cheever in the Arrows, a tremendous result for him, and for Derek Warwick 4th. 5th, Ivan Capelli. 6th, Thierry Boutsen. Senna and Prost, however, still led the championship. So a crack had appeared in the McLaren armour. Brazil's close ties with Portugal would give Senna moral support. But it was Alain Prost on pole position for the 2nd time in 1988, and as they accelerated down to the first corner, Prost held on to the lead. Ayrton Senna alongside him managed to go round the outside, so it was Senna leading from Alain Prost. Behind them, Ivan Capelli in 3rd place. The Brazilians, meanwhile, the other two Brazilians, were having a battle of their own. But Senna led from Prost, then Capelli, Berger, Mansell making a return, and then Mauricio Gugelmin and Nelson Piquet. At the start of lap 2, Prost tried to overtake, but Senna didn't want him to. However, Prost managed to get through and take the lead from Ayrton Senna. Ivan Capelli watched it all from third place. Prost, with a new chassis, was soon pulling away from Ayrton Senna, coping with poor fuel consumption. He had Ivan Capelli right up behind him. Gerhard Berger was there too, and Nigel Mansell, making his return to Grand Prix racing after his chickenpox, was closing up as well. And then Ivan Capelli went down the inside of Ayrton Senna, and the Brazilian could do nothing about it. Capelli up into second place, the March driver really on form. Ayrton Senna was then caught by Gerhard Berger, who went down the inside and cleanly up into third place, although Senna nearly ran into the back of him. But as Berger chased Ivan Capelli, the fire extinguisher went off and he went into a spin, ending up in the dust. And there he remained, Gerhard Berger out of the race. Others were in problems too. Lapping a slowing Palmer, Senna didn't have enough room. He hit Palmer and punctured a tyre. Mansell, right behind Senna, went off, avoiding him. Senna came in to change a punctured tyre, dropping from third to sixth. Mansell, meanwhile, limped back to the pits, out of the race. Mauricio Gugelmin retired from 7th place. Ivan Capelli, seeing his teammate stopped at the side of the track, eased up, allowing Alain Prost to cruise to win number 33 in his career and number 5 of 1988. This was a race that Senna should have won, but because Prost had won it, he still had a chance of taking the championship. Michele Alboreto ran out of fuel right at the end of the race and dropped from 3rd to 5th. So Prost won and took the lead of the championship. Ivan Capelli was on the rostrum for the first time in his career. Thierry Boutsen was 3rd for the 5th time in 1988, and Ayrton Senna was only 6th. Thierry Boutsen had now moved up to 4th place in the championship, ahead of Michele Alboreto. The scene now moved down the road, literally, to Jerez in Spain for the Spanish Grand Prix, round 14 of the championship. The McLarens were once again on the front row of the grid, but it was Alain Prost who made the better start, and he was followed through by Nigel Mansell, who also got ahead of Ayrton Senna in 3rd spot. A tremendous traffic jam at the start of the Spanish Grand Prix, but Alain Prost out in front. Mansell, then Senna, under pressure from Riccardo Patrese, very much on form, with Ivan Capelli right up behind him, and then a gap. Thierry Boutsen came next with a damaged front nose wing, overtaken by Alessandro Nannini, and behind him were the two Ferraris. The pace was fast and furious on this difficult circuit, so twisty that it's almost impossible to overtake. But Ayrton Senna tried it, trying to get past Nigel Mansell. However, he slid a little bit wide and Mansell got back into 2nd place again. Prost, Mansell, putting pressure on the Frenchman. Senna, Patrese and Capelli. And Capelli had soon got up past Patrese and was pressuring Ayrton Senna. Lap after lap he tried, and then down into the final corner he got alongside and squeezed through, up into 3rd place. But it didn't last long, he was soon out with a broken engine. Alain Prost came into the pits for a change of tyres and didn't lose the lead. As he rejoined, he stayed first ahead of Nigel Mansell, and he was heading for just the kind of result he needed to keep his championship aspirations alive. Ayrton Senna also came in for a tyre change, dropping from 4th to 7th. But Alain Prost was untouchable. Although Nigel Mansell tried hard to challenge, Prost was relatively comfortable. Senna, however, wasn't giving up. Here he moves up into 5th place, overtaking Gerhard Berger's Ferrari, and ultimately he would finish 4th. But Alain Prost was on his way to win number 34, his 2nd win in 8 days, and his 6th of the 1988 season. His championship hopes were well and truly still alive. However, as the drivers are only allowed to score 11 times in the 16 rounds, Prost would only count 3 points instead of 9 for this win. Second, again, was Nigel Mansell, his 2nd score of the season, and 3rd was Alessandro Nannini on the rostrum for the 2nd time in 1988. Senna was a vital 4th, 5th was Patrese, 6th Gerhard Berger. The championship now moved east for the final 2 rounds of the series, starting with the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. This, of course, is Satoru Nakajima's home circuit, and were given a driver's eye view by him. We accelerate down past the pits and into the first corner, the double apex right-hander. Note the speed in kilometres per hour, bottom right, the red band giving the position on the circuit and the gear number under the picture. Nakajima's now approaching the S-curve, the series of bends behind the pits, mainly taken in 3rd gear. And this is where Nigel Mansell crashed in 1987. Through the last part of the S-curve sequence, there's then a short straight, accelerating up to nearly 300 kilometres per hour, before the Dana curve, taken in 3rd gear, and then under the crossover, the speed approaches 300 again, before the very, very tight left-handed hairpin. Heavy braking there, and then accelerating up, back through the gears again. 200 kilometres an hour, 300 kilometres an hour approached, before heavy braking again for the very tricky double apex spoon curve. And then hard on the accelerator, back up to over 300 kilometres per hour. On this back straight, and then there's the 130R bend, before braking right down again for the very, very tight chicane at the end of the lap, 1st gear of course, and then back up through the gears again, down pit straight. You can see how tough it is on fuel consumption and brakes at Suzuka. The big problem on race day were threatening clouds, but it was mainly dry as the cars formed up on the grid with Ayrton Senna on pole, Alain Prost alongside him as they waited for the lights to turn green. And when they did turn green, Ayrton Senna stalled and virtually stopped. He managed to get going again, but Alain Prost was way out ahead and leading from Gerhard Berger, and Ayrton Senna was way back in the pack. So Prost led, Berger in 2nd place. They were pulling away from Ivan Capelli, then Derek Warwick and Nigel Mansell having a coming together. Nigel Mansell losing his nose cone. Here is the replay again as Senna gets going, stops almost immediately. Nelson Piquet gets well sideways as he tries to avoid the McLaren, but Ayrton Senna eventually gets underway. So Prost led from Berger and then Capelli, then a gap. Alboreto, Boutsen, Nannini, Patrese are all ahead of Ayrton Senna in 8th place. Senna then moved up 1 place ahead of Patrese into 7th. Then he picked off Alessandro Nannini. He was now in 6th place. This was to be a great drive, but Ivan Capelli was also doing fantastic things in the normally aspirated March, overtaking the turbo Ferrari of Gerhard Berger. And soon he was right up on Alain Prost's tail. Prost, Capelli right up behind him. And when Prost missed a gear, going down past the pits, Ivan Capelli swooped and led a Grand Prix for the first time in his career. But sadly, it was to be short-lived. Alain Prost pulled back alongside and went back into the lead again. But Ivan Capelli had made his point in front of the Japanese, his car sponsored by a Japanese company. Soon, Ayrton Senna was looming in his mirrors. Prost, Capelli, Senna, and then Senna went ahead of the March driver. The March's engine cutting out and Capelli sadly heading for retirement. Prost then had Senna looming in his mirrors. And it was surely just a matter of time before the Brazilian would overtake the Frenchman. Down past the pits they came and Senna was up into the lead. A fantastic drive. So Senna, on a slippery track, pulled away from Alain Prost. Prost struggling with a gearbox problem, but Senna heading for the checkered flag, and how delighted he was. This would give him the World Championship. There, he had fulfilled his life's ambition. Ayrton Senna, World Champion, 1988. He was delighted, and so were the Japanese. Alain Prost completed another McLaren 1-2, and Thierry Boutsen was third yet again. But no one could resist drenching Ayrton Senna in this, his glorious hour. So the pressure was off as the teams and drivers headed for Adelaide and the final round of the World Championship, the Australian Grand Prix, one of the field's most favourite Grand Prix of the year. The two McLaren Hondas again on the front row of the grid. But it's Alain Prost who got the better start. From Ayrton Senna, Gerhard Berger was third, and then the two Williams Judds sandwiching Nelson Piquet's Lotus Honda. But at the front, it was Prost and Senna. Gerhard Berger all over the curbs in third spot. Then a gap to Nigel Mansell in fourth. Already out of the race was Michele Alboreto in his last drive for Ferrari. But Alain Prost was pulling away. Gerhard Berger, however, was beginning to give Ayrton Senna a hard time, and Nelson Piquet moved ahead of Nigel Mansell. Meanwhile, the two Williams Judd drivers were having a battle, with Riccardo Patrese also overtaking Mansell. But it was Berger who was really on the way up. First of all, pressurising Ayrton Senna, and getting past him, even in a rather untidy and scrappy manoeuvre, and then closing on Alain Prost. Alain Prost already knew that the Ferrari couldn't last the distance with its fuel, and so he let him go quite easily. So Berger led from Alain Prost in second place. However, few people reckoned with backmarker problems around the Adelaide circuit. But as Berger lapped Stefano Modena, he came up on René Arnoux, who had been unsighted and didn't know the Ferrari was there. The two came together, spun round, and Berger was out of the race. Alain Prost was back into the lead again. So Prost led, and further back there was still the great battle between the two Williams Judd drivers. They were tussling over fourth place, but knew that they would have brake problems later in the race. Riccardo Patrese spun out, letting Nigel Mansell through to fourth, but he too would crash a few laps later. So everyone got ready for the last checkered flag of the season. Alain Prost heading for win number 35 in his career, all of them during this turbocharged era of Grand Prix racing. and it was only fitting that he should take the last checkered flag of the turbo era and of 1988. A win for Alain Prost. So Prost was the winner of the final Grand Prix, the Australian Grand Prix, with Ayrton Senna in second place, Nelson Piquet in third, Riccardo Patrese fourth, Thierry Boutsen fifth and Ivan Capelli sixth. The McLaren-Honda pair had dominated the season, but it was Ayrton Senna who won 8 races to become the 1988 Formula One world champion.